I didn't set out that morning to unravel my life. I just wanted peace, the mundane kind that comes from folding laundry in a quiet house while the scent of coffee lingers. Yet, the knock at the door threw everything off balance. It wasn't a loud knock, more like someone testing if I was home at all. I pulled the door open and stared at Marie, my sister. Her eyes darted past me like she was looking for someone. Her hair was messy, as though she'd been in a rush to get here. "Can we talk?" she muttered, barely meeting my gaze. Something in her voice didn't sit right, but I stepped aside, letting her in. She hugged herself as she sat on the couch, not the usual carefree Marie who'd show up with gossip and wine. This version of her looked like she was unraveling. I didn't have to coax much before she spilled her cryptic story about mistakes, regret, and something I can't live with anymore. She didn't say who or what, just that she was ashamed. I should have known then that her tears were more than guilt. They were warnings. Hours later, after Marie left, I found myself unsettled. I wasn't naive, and when my gut told me to look deeper, I listened. I wasn't the type of wife who ignored the signs. Maybe it started with how distracted Tom had been lately, always checking his phone, answering questions with vague half-smiles. Or how he suddenly made plans I wasn't part of. It had felt odd but not alarming. Until now. I waited until Tom got home. I didn't pounce, not yet. I went about dinner like it was any other night, but I watched him closely. His hands fidgeted with his fork, eyes flicking toward his phone every few minutes. That night, while he slept, I took his phone from the nightstand. His passcode hadn't changed. He probably thought I'd never check. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the texts, but my heart was like a drum in my chest. Then I saw it. Marie's name. Messages that started harmless enough, but shifted into something damning. The way they spoke to each other, the hidden emotions beneath each line, made my stomach churn. I felt like I'd swallowed something sharp and couldn't get it out. It wasn't rage at first, it was disbelief. How do you process that the two people closest to you betrayed you? But disbelief didn't last long. Instead, a burning question planted itself in my mind. Why? And I wasn't going to ask quietly. I closed his phone, placed it back exactly where I found it, and sat in the dark for hours. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to lie down and drown in it. When morning came, I knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I woke before Tom and went through the motions, flipping pancakes, setting the table, and brewing the coffee. The kitchen filled with the familiar hum of a morning routine, though inside, everything felt jagged and out of place. When he finally walked in, rubbing his eyes and mumbling a greeting, I noticed how ordinary he looked. It almost made me laugh, how normal he appeared while the truth sat between us like a ticking bomb. I moved around the kitchen calmly, pouring his coffee and setting it down in front of him. He muttered his thanks as he sat, unaware that every bite of pancake, every sip of coffee, was being watched. I'd made up my mind to push, but not in the way he'd expect. When I asked about Marie, I did it with the same tone I'd used to comment on the weather. His reaction was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation, but it was enough. He claimed they hadn't talked much, brushing it off like the mention of her was insignificant. The lie came so easily that it made my stomach tighten. I didn't let it show. Instead, I told him Marie had stopped by the day before and looked upset, almost like she'd been on the verge of confessing something important. He stayed quiet longer than necessary, weighing his words before finally asking what she'd said. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I mentioned how strange it felt, her showing up like that. I let the silence work its way between us, giving him just enough space to squirm without knowing how much I already knew. When I finally mentioned checking his phone, the shift in him was immediate. His fork slipped from his hand, and the blood drained from his face. The initial shock gave way to defensive anger. He accused me of violating his privacy, but the words rang hollow, like he was grasping at straws. I wasn't about to let him deflect. I laid it all out, his late-night messages, the tone of them, the way he'd spoken to her like she wasn't my sister, but someone meant for him alone. The fight drained out of him as quickly as it came. He sank into his chair and pressed his hands to his face, mumbling things I'd heard before from other men in stories just like this. It hadn't meant anything. It had been a mistake. He'd been weak. I didn't soften. His excuses were as predictable as the sunrise. I needed more than his self-pity. I needed to know why. When I asked him, his words faltered again, circling the same hollow explanations. Something about feeling distant, about being in a bad place. He claimed that he and Marie had just fallen into something neither of them had meant to happen. Hearing him say it aloud didn't make it any more real, but it did make it infuriating. I couldn't understand how he expected me to believe that it was some passive accident, like they'd both tripped into betrayal. He insisted there was no love involved, no feelings for her, only regret. Regret. It came up again and again, as though the word itself was a shield. He thought saying he regretted it would soften the blow, but it only twisted the knife deeper. Regret didn't change the past or undo the betrayal. It was just a word used to cover 1,000 bad decisions. I asked one last question, though I hadn't planned to. Did he love her? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. His denial came fast, almost frantic, as if the idea itself repulsed him. He swore that he loved me, that it had never been about love with her, only weakness. His insistence wasn't enough to soothe the storm inside me. The damage was already done, and no amount of pleading could rewind the clock. He promised he'd do whatever it took to fix things, but I wasn't looking for promises. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to save what was left. But I wasn't done yet. The full truth hadn't come to light, and I wasn't stopping until I knew every piece of it after breakfast. The house felt suffocating. Tom lingered near the kitchen, as if hovering could somehow undo what had been exposed. I ignored him and went about my day, though every movement felt like it belonged to someone else. He watched me, probably wondering what I was thinking, but I wasn't ready to give him that answer yet. I left the house with no explanation. The door closing behind me felt like drawing a line in the sand. I needed space, but more than that, I needed clarity. Walking always helped me think, and as I moved through familiar streets, fragments of conversations with Marie played back in my mind. Little things she'd said over the past few months that I'd brushed off, how she seemed restless, how she'd asked strange questions about Tom and me. The signs had been there, but I'd been too trusting to connect them. I ended up at the park where Marie and I used to meet when we needed to vent. It was quiet, the kind of place where secrets seemed safe. But now the thought of her felt like poison. I sat on a bench and replayed everything, trying to piece together what drove them to betray me. Tom's excuses, distance, weakness, weren't enough. There was more, and I knew it. By the time I got home, the sun was setting. Tom was sitting in the living room, staring at his hands like he was preparing for an execution. I walked past him without a word, heading straight for our bedroom closet. His clothes were still neatly hanging in their usual place, his shirts organized just the way I liked them. I pulled down a box from the top shelf, the one where we kept old letters, cards, and mementos. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I trusted my instincts. At first, it was the usual stuff, vacation photos, anniversary cards. But near the bottom of the pile, I found something that didn't belong. A folded sheet of paper with messy handwriting that wasn't mine or Tom's. Marie's handwriting. The note was brief, barely a few lines, but it was enough to make my pulse race. She'd written about guilt and how she couldn't live with the weight of their secret anymore. She mentioned that weekend. A weekend I hadn't even realized they'd both disappeared from my life at the same time. A sinking feeling settled in my gut as I realized they hadn't just betrayed me once. It had been longer than I thought. I sat on the bed, staring at the note. Tom must have kept it, thinking it was buried in the past. He was wrong. It wasn't buried. It was sitting there like a landmine, waiting to explode. I heard his footsteps approach the doorway. When I looked up, his face was pale, eyes darting from the note to my expression. He knew I'd found something, but he didn't know how much. I didn't bother with questions. Instead, I told him I knew there was more than one mistake, more than one moment of weakness. His face crumbled as he realized there was no way to spin it anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and admitted that it hadn't been a one-time thing. It had gone on for months, slipping under my radar while I'd been busy trusting the people I loved most. His voice cracked as he tried to explain the timeline, but I barely heard him. I was already working through my next steps in my mind. I wasn't going to wait for him to figure out how to make amends. I'd spent too long cleaning up other people's messes. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, sharper than I expected. He needed to understand that this wasn't just about regret, it was about accountability. He wanted forgiveness wrapped in understanding, but he wasn't going to get it that easily. If he thought regret was enough, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't about mistakes anymore. It was war, and I wasn't going to lose. Tom stayed on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched like a man waiting for a sentence to be passed down. I stood, holding the note in my hand, the paper crinkling slightly from how tight my grip was. The silence stretched, but I wasn't about to let him sit there feeling sorry for himself. I told him I knew about the weekend she mentioned in the note. I reminded him how I'd spent that Saturday cleaning out the garage alone, thinking he was working overtime. I'd even sent Marie a text, asking if she wanted to come over for dinner. She'd said she was out of town with friends. Friends. That light echoed now, louder than ever. Tom winced as I spoke, like each detail was another punch. When I asked why he'd kept the note, he didn't have an answer that made sense. He mumbled something about feeling guilty and not knowing what to do with it. I told him that guilt wasn't a souvenir you kept tucked away, it was supposed to burn. He admitted then that the note was Marie's attempt to cut ties, to end things before I ever found out. She'd written it after their last meeting. That revelation hit harder than I expected. Marie had tried to end it, but not out of loyalty to me. No, it was because she couldn't live with the fear of being exposed. I walked to the window and stared out at the fading sky. I thought about all the times Marie had confided in me over the years, all the things I'd trusted her with. She told me about every bad date, every heartbreak, every moment of self-doubt. And yet, in the end, she'd kept the worst secret of all. When I turned back to Tom, I could see that he was unraveling. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed, like he'd been crying when I wasn't looking. He told me he didn't even recognize himself anymore, that he'd become someone he hated. I almost laughed at that. I told him he wasn't the only one struggling to recognize the person he'd become. His confession was full now, every sordid detail, every weak justification. They'd crossed a line once, during that weekend, and instead of stopping, they'd let it become a cycle of meetings that left both of them feeling trapped in a web of guilt and desire. He swore it hadn't been about love, only some twisted attempt to fill whatever void he thought existed in his life. But I wasn't buying it. People didn't destroy their lives just for the sake of filling a void. There was always something deeper, something they didn't want to admit. I didn't want his apologies or his reasoning. I wanted the truth, the unpolished, brutal truth. Why her? Why my sister? Out of everyone in the world, why did he choose the one person who shared my blood, my memories, my childhood? He hesitated again, and I could see that he was debating whether to tell me the real reason or keep dancing around it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told me that being with Marie had felt like stepping back in time, like pretending, for just a moment, that life was simpler and that he wasn't weighed down by responsibilities. It was a selfish, pathetic answer, and he knew it. But it was also the truth. And somehow, that made it worse. I didn't yell, though I wanted to. Instead, I told him how disgusting it was that he'd chosen to relive some fantasy at the cost of everything real we'd built together. I reminded him that I'd been by his side for every struggle, every failure, and every success. I'd been the constant while he'd chased after some fleeting feeling of freedom. Tom sank further, like the weight of my words was finally crushing him. He asked me if there was any way to fix it, to undo the damage. I shook my head. He was looking for an easy solution, a way to put things back together like nothing had happened. But life didn't work like that. I wasn't a broken vase he could glue back together and stick on a shelf. I told him the only reason I hadn't walked out the door yet was because I wasn't done. There were still things I needed to do, questions that only Marie could answer. And until I had those answers, I wasn't making any decisions. Tom looked terrified when I said her name. I could see the panic setting in as he realized I was going to confront her. He warned me that it wouldn't bring me peace, that it might only make things worse. But I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for the truth, no matter how messy it was. By the time I left the room, Tom was sitting there like a man waiting for the final blow. And maybe, in a way, that's exactly what I intended to deliver. I drove to Marie's apartment without giving myself time to second-guess it. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange calm settle over me, like my mind had decided that anger wasn't enough anymore. I needed clarity. She needed to look me in the eye and explain why she'd done it, why she'd chosen to tear apart everything we had as sisters. Her building loomed ahead, familiar and yet foreign now. I'd helped her move in here, carried boxes up those same stairs, shared takeout on that same balcony. I climbed the steps slowly, the weight of betrayal heavy on every step. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me but not shocked. Maybe she'd been expecting this moment, dreading it even. She didn't greet me. She just stepped aside, letting me in without a word. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender, the same as always. I took a moment to glance around and noticed the wine glasses on the coffee table, one with lipstick on the rim and the other without. She hadn't been alone recently, and the realization made my stomach tighten. Marie stayed near the door, as if keeping her distance would protect her. I wasn't going to let her hide behind silence. I told her to sit down, my tone leaving no room for refusal. She sat but kept her hands folded in her lap, avoiding my gaze like a guilty child. I didn't ease into it. I told her I knew everything. Her shoulders sagged, and she finally looked up at me, eyes glassy, with unshed tears. She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she whispered that she was sorry, that she'd been sorry from the start.
Sorry.
That word again, like an apology, could undo months of deceit. I told her I didn't want her apology, I wanted the truth. I wanted to know when it had started and, more importantly, why. She hesitated, like she was afraid of how her answers would sound aloud. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook. Finally, she admitted it began during that weekend when Tom was supposed to be working overtime, and she'd been staying with me after a bad breakup. She'd felt lonely, vulnerable. He'd felt disconnected and restless. They'd both convinced themselves it was harmless at first, just talking, just comforting each other. But comfort had turned into something else. I stayed quiet, letting her unravel the rest. She said it wasn't about love for either of them, more like a toxic escape from their real lives. She cried as she told me how much she hated herself for what she'd done, how she'd wanted to tell me but couldn't bear the thought of destroying our relationship. I could tell she wanted sympathy, wanted me to see her as someone who'd made a mistake, not a monster. But I wasn't there to give her comfort. I reminded her that she didn't just destroy her own life. She tore mine apart too. She'd taken the trust I'd given her, the bond we'd built over a lifetime, and shattered it. And for what? A fleeting moment of validation? Marie sobbed openly now, her whole body shaking. But I didn't soften. I told her that tears wouldn't fix this. What I wanted wasn't pity, it was answers.
Why Tom?
Why the one man she knew she could never have without breaking me in the process? Her answer hit harder than anything else. She said it wasn't about Tom, it was about her. She'd always felt like she was living in my shadow, always compared to me by friends, family, and strangers alike. For once, she wanted something that was mine, not to hurt me, but to feel like she could be chosen over me. The words sank in like stones, pulling me down into something darker than anger. I realized she hadn't betrayed me because of anything I'd done. She'd done it because of who she was, who she'd let herself become. Her jealousy, her insecurities, had festered until they'd destroyed everything. I stood up, unable to listen anymore. I told her she'd gotten what she wanted. She'd broken something that could never be put back together. Whether she liked it or not, she'd succeeded in being unforgettable, though not in the way she'd imagined. She reached out as I walked to the door, begging me to let her fix things, to find some way to salvage what was left between us. But there was nothing left. I told her I didn't know if I'd ever forgive her. That wasn't something she got to ask for. She watched, helpless, as I left her behind, closing the door on the life we'd once shared as sisters. As I drove home, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I wasn't just grieving my marriage. I was grieving the loss of someone I thought would always be on my side. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let their choices define me. They might have betrayed me, but I wasn't the one who was weak. When I walked through the door, Tom was waiting, his face filled with questions and fear. He didn't ask what Marie had said, but I saw in his eyes that he knew the damage was done. And though the night was quiet, it felt like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Waiting for the final reckoning, the house felt unnervingly still as I stood there, staring at Tom. His eyes searched mine for some sign of what I'd learned, but I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deep the knife had cut. Instead, I moved past him, heading toward the kitchen, needing something, anything, to ground myself. The hum of the refrigerator, the clink of glass as I poured water, the coolness of the rim against my lips, all of it felt distant, mechanical. Tom stayed by the doorway, watching like a man afraid to step closer. His silence was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. I finally set the glass down and told him that I'd spoken to Marie. The words landed like a hammer. His breath caught, but he didn't speak. He knew better. I told him that she hadn't spared any details, that I knew the truth now, not just about what happened, but about why. I saw his expression shift from guilt to something else, shame, maybe, or regret twisted into desperation. He began to say that he was sorry again, but I raised a hand to stop him. I was sick of that word, sick of what it represented. Instead, I laid it all out. How Marie felt trapped in my shadow, how she'd convinced herself that taking something of mine would make her feel whole. I asked him if he'd known, that she'd always resented me, that she'd harbored this silent, poisonous envy. He shook his head quickly, insisting that he'd had no idea. For a moment, I believed him. Tom wasn't smart enough to play some long game. He wasn't a mastermind in this mess. He was a weak man who'd let himself be swept away by someone else's brokenness. But his ignorance didn't make him innocent. I reminded him that he'd chosen her, over and over again. It wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern, a betrayal repeated until it became routine. Did he ever think of me during those moments? I asked. Did he ever picture my face and realize what he was destroying? Tom's shoulders sagged as if the weight of my words was too much to bear. He admitted that he had, but by then, he'd felt so trapped in his own failures that it seemed easier to keep going than to stop and face the truth. He looked at me with pleading eyes, telling me that he wanted to go back to the beginning, to the version of us before all of this. I told him that version didn't exist anymore. He'd burned it to the ground the moment he crossed that line. The conversation hung between us, raw and bitter. I saw him breaking down, saw the cracks spreading wider. He said he wasn't just trying to fix our marriage. He was trying to fix himself, to be the man I deserved. I didn't believe him, not yet. Words didn't carry much weight anymore. When I finally sat across from him, I asked the one question I hadn't dared to ask before. If I hadn't found out, would it have ever stopped? Tom's silence told me everything I needed to know. Maybe he wanted to believe it would have ended, but deep down, we both knew it wouldn't have. Secrets like that don't stop. They rot everything until there's nothing left to hide behind. I stood, my mind made up. I wasn't going to spend another second pretending that things could be patched up with apologies and promises. He asked me what I was going to do, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him I didn't know yet, but I needed space to figure it out. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door before he could say anything else. The cold night air hit my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As I drove away, I realized I wasn't just running from him. I was reclaiming myself piece by piece. This wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. But whatever came next, it was going to be on my terms that I didn't go far. I parked near a quiet stretch of the river where the water moved slow and steady, unlike the chaos in my mind. The city lights shimmered on the surface, distorting with every ripple, a perfect reflection of my life at that moment. I sat there, letting the cool air settle over me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all. The truth wasn't just a clean break, it was jagged and sharp, and every piece I picked up seemed to cut deeper. I wasn't just grieving a marriage. I was mourning the loss of trust, the death of the person I'd thought Tom was. I was grieving my sister too, or at least the version of her I'd believed in. I stayed until my fingers were cold and my thoughts started to untangle. I knew I couldn't stay in that limbo forever. Eventually, I drove back home, though home felt like a word that no longer fit. Tom was sitting in the same spot I'd left him, as if he hadn't moved. The second I walked in, his eyes snapped to mine, filled with that same desperate hope that maybe I'd come back with forgiveness in hand. But I hadn't. Not yet. I didn't say anything at first. I set my keys down and walked past him toward the bedroom, where I started pulling clothes from drawers and stuffing them into a bag. I wasn't doing it to make a scene. I needed distance to think clearly, to figure out what my next step was. Tom followed me, his voice cracking as he asked what I was doing. He sounded like he already knew, but couldn't accept it. I told him I needed time away, somewhere without reminders of what he'd done. His protests were quiet but frantic. He begged me not to leave, not to shut him out completely. He told me he was scared, not just of losing me, but of losing who he was without me. I didn't waver. I reminded him that he wasn't scared when he made the choice to betray me. He hadn't been scared when he answered Marie's texts or when he'd found excuses to see her. Now he wanted fear to act like glue, binding me to him. But I wasn't his safety net anymore. I zipped the bag closed and met his gaze. He looked hollow, as if every ounce of fight had drained out of him. I told him that leaving didn't mean I was done. I wasn't running. I was reclaiming my sanity. He had torn everything apart, and now I needed space to figure out if there was anything left worth salvaging. He reached for my hand, hesitating before his fingers brushed mine. I saw the question in his eyes, the silent plea for something. Hope, maybe. But I couldn't give him that. Not yet. I pulled my hand away gently, not out of cruelty, but because I couldn't give him answers when I barely had any of my own. I left without looking back, unsure if I'd ever walk back through that door again. I stayed at a small hotel on the edge of town, far enough to feel removed but close enough that it didn't feel like exile. The room was plain and cold, but the quiet was exactly what I needed. I sat on the bed, staring at my phone as messages from Tom flashed across the screen. Apologies, questions, promises. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I did something I hadn't expected. I called my mom. She answered after a few rings, her voice warm and familiar, unaware of the storm waiting on the other end of the line. When I told her what happened, there was a long pause before she spoke again. Her voice trembled with disbelief as she asked me if I was sure, as though maybe it had all been some misunderstanding. But when she heard the certainty in my tone, her sadness came through like a wave. I could tell she was trying to process it, to piece together how something like this could happen between her daughters. She asked what I needed, and for the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of relief. I told her I didn't know yet, but I just needed someone to listen, to remind me that I wasn't completely alone in this. We stayed on the phone until my voice grew hoarse, and the weight in my chest felt a little lighter. After I hung up, I sat there in the dark, letting the conversation replay in my mind. I wasn't ready to forgive Tom or Marie, but I wasn't going to be consumed by their betrayal either. This was my life, and no matter how fractured it felt now, I was determined to put it back together in my own way. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in a while, I felt sleep creeping in. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Whatever happened next, I'd face it on my terms. The next morning, sunlight poured through the thin curtains of the hotel room, too bright for how heavy I still felt. The calm from the night before had worn off, replaced by that familiar ache in my chest. But I pushed myself up, showered, dressed, and prepared for what came next. I wasn't going to hide in that room forever. If my life was in pieces, I was going to be the one to decide where each piece landed. I checked my phone, several missed calls and texts from Tom. Most of them were the same, pleading, apologizing, begging me to come back. But one text stood out. It wasn't from Tom, it was from Marie. She'd written, "Please.
Can we talk?"
I need to explain. I stared at the screen for a long time. She wanted a chance to explain more, as if there was some hidden truth that would make what she did less despicable. Maybe she hoped for forgiveness, Or maybe she just wanted to unburden herself. But forgiveness wasn't a gift I was ready to give. Instead of replying, I put the phone down and headed out. I had somewhere else to be. By the time I reached the house, I felt the familiar weight settle over me. Tom's car was still in the driveway, like it hadn't moved since I left. The sight of it made my stomach twist, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I stepped inside, and the door's quiet click felt like the final note of a funeral song. Tom was in the kitchen, pacing aimlessly. When he saw me, relief flooded his face, but it was tempered by caution. He started to speak, but I cut him off. I told him this wasn't a moment for apologies or promises. It was time for honesty. No more avoiding the hard truths. He nodded, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. I asked him the question that had haunted me all night. What was his plan? If I hadn't found out, if I hadn't dug through his phone and confronted Marie, what was he going to do? The question seemed to knock the wind out of him. He admitted that he hadn't had a plan. He'd been paralyzed by his own guilt and indecision, hoping the whole thing would somehow fade away. He'd convinced himself that if he acted normal enough, life would reset itself. His answer wasn't a surprise, but it still stung. I told him that hoping problems disappear doesn't erase the damage. It just lets the rot spread. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he stayed silent, absorbing every word like it was a sentence being read aloud. And then I dropped the real question, the one that had been buried beneath all the others. Why should I stay? His face fell, and for a moment, he looked like he couldn't breathe. But then something shifted. Instead of scrambling for excuses, he stood there and told me the truth. He didn't deserve me to stay. He knew that. He said he'd made the worst mistake of his life, and no matter how much he wanted to fix things, he wasn't sure he ever could. Hearing that should have felt like victory, but it didn't. It just felt hollow. I told him that I wasn't staying for him. If I stayed, and I wasn't sure I would, it would be for me. To decide how my life moved forward, to take back control of what had been taken from me. I wasn't some shattered version of myself waiting to be rescued. I was going to rebuild, with or without him. Tom's voice cracked when he said he'd do whatever it took to earn back my trust, even if it took years. But I warned him that trust wasn't something you just earned back with time and effort. It was something you rebuilt piece by piece, and it was fragile. One wrong move, one lie, and the whole thing would shatter again. I didn't make any promises.
I did know him that.
But I told him that I wasn't done fighting for my own life, and that was the only promise I needed to make to myself. As I walked back toward the door, Tom called after me, not with a desperate plea, but with something quieter. He told me that he loved me, and that he always had. I paused, not because the words swayed me, but because they reminded me of what could have been, what should have been. But love wasn't enough, not anymore. I stepped outside, letting the fresh air wash over me. The road ahead wasn't clear yet, but at least I knew one thing. I wasn't standing still. Whether Tom stayed in my story or became a footnote was still undecided. But for now, I was moving forward. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future was mine to shape, and that was all the strength I needed.